Her 9000's Game Room.
Now, it's probably apparent to anyone who's followed my YouTube channel that I'm not just a fan of video games, I'm a big fan of horror. Now, I'm a fan of the 1950s horror comics and beyond that horror in general, and this all started with my exposure to several films when young. And soon these films turned to comics and comics turned to books, and this is how I came to find myself reading the work of several authors, including the likes of Richard Matheson and Stephen King. Nowadays it wouldn't be that huge an issue to find a game being made with the involvement of some kind of horror director or writer, but back then, when I heard that a SNES game was being made based on a film which was apparently based on a sort of horror short which I'd read, it was actually kind of exciting. Sure, the very fact it was based on a film should have started my spidey senses tingling, but I was less jaded and cynical back then. The original The Lawnmower Man was a short story which was written by Stephen King and originally published in the 1975 May issue of a US magazine called Cavalier. Later it was included in King's 1978 short story collection Night Shift, which is where I find it a good 10 years later. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it, but I will simply say this. It's a little tale with connections to sort of mythical beings and has no futuristic science to it. Okay, so beyond some kind of weird ZX Spectrum game with an RRP of $3.99 or less, I don't really see how back then the idea of this story could make a game, at least not a proper game on a 16-bit system. My excitement died pretty much when I saw The Lawnmower Man the Film. Sure, the film is named after the Stephen King short story of the same name, but it basically has pretty much sod all to do with it. Again, I don't want to spoil something you have yet to experience, but I'll give a brief idea of what the film is about. The film is about a simple-minded gardener and a scientist who decides to experiment on him using a combination of drugs and virtual reality exercises and games. The film had some interesting CGI in it and some decent ideas, but overall was a very run-of-the-mill average movie. It was no wonder that it was originally titled Stephen King's The Lawnmower Man. But this ended when King managed to successfully sue the producers and have his name removed on the basis that his story in this film basically had sod all in common. So on the outside of it, a man being trained with VR games doesn't sound like a bad setup for a game, does it? Well, the reviews for it back in the day were kind of all over the place, with some claiming it to be absolute crap, while the odd one praised it like it was some kind of proto-Mario 64. But I think the general consensus was that it was an incredibly average game. The game is basically composed of different parts. There's a platformer, then there's a 3D first-person flying game with a lot of Mode 7 thrown into the mix. But there are also some levels where you're flying in a sort of ship or driving along on a futuristic bike, where it's basically a horizontal or vertical shooter. The main issue is that the platformer is okay if incredibly pedestrian, whereas the 3D Mode 7 heavy stuff, rather than being the icing on the cake or the jam to separate the layers and mix things up a little, is more like the Brussels sprouts you were made to eat as a child if you wanted your Christmas pudding. That is, if your Christmas pudding was only just edible, non-exciting Christmas pudding. The shooter bits are not bad, but nor are they too good. Everything is kind of average, but you still feel basically grateful that they tried to break things up and mix the genres and elements together to keep you entertained. If you want to know what the platforming bit is like, well, imagine a sort of amateur run-and-gun Contra Turrican kind of thing. You shoot stuff, you jump around, you pick up bigger and better weapons to shoot even more things with. When you first see the Mode 7 bits, you'll be a bit impressed and be like, wow, something different that doesn't look bad. But soon this will turn into, oh great, one of those bloody bits again. These bits basically involve shooting at wireframe enemies, avoiding their shots and trying not to crash into stuff. It could potentially be exciting, but you realise all too soon that none of the enemies could hit an elephant with a rocket launcher. Their AI is simply more brain dead than almost any you will have faced before. And let's remember, in 1977 the Atari 2600, a machine with only a 1.19 MHz processor, managed to show competitive functioning AI in its Tanks, the video game cart known as Combat. Not much of a gameplay rating here, that's for sure, and also the enemies, even in the last few levels, have the worst AI ever. If anything will get you in these sort of bits, it's more walls than enemies. I would have scrapped these bits as novel looking as they are and concentrated on doing my best to ensure the other bits were more enjoyable, but I guess they figured this stuff was what would stand out the best when printed in magazines, and it's what would sell the game. The amount of times I crashed into a wall while flying through this cyberspace, and bear in mind, one crash and you're thrown out of it and have to start again. I did it so many times, it's infuriating. Don't try this game with anybody in the room who's young, because I swear you will turn the air blue with cuss words you didn't even realise you used. It's infuriating. And for me, that kind of is this game in general. It's an infuriating game. The sound is pretty basic, even if I find the music strangely funky and appealing in a way that I can't quite understand. The controls are decent. There are no major bugbears with this game beyond what I've mentioned, but the way it feels when you play it, you can't find yourself saying anything other than, yeah, this is generic, it's average. Or, well, at least they tried something, but it didn't work. So I think it's pretty clear that I'd give this game a 5 out of 10. Would I recommend a purchase? Only if you can get it for around £5 and fancy something you don't already own. I've had this knocking around in my collection so long I have no idea when or where I got it, but looking online, looking about, you can get the cart for around £5. And if you're trying new things, then give it a shot. You might like it more than I do. But don't go in here thinking it's got anything to do with a Stephen King story. Don't go in here thinking that any of the running and gunning in it is anywhere on the lines of Contra or Rolling Thunder. The game is just so average it hurts. Okay, that's Kurt9000 signing off saying keep on gaming.